I'm the architect, and tonight we're trying a case in the only courtroom that never adjourns, history. The defendant today is not a person, it's an idea, a seductively expensive idea. A national bedtime story whispered into the ears of every generation that grows up under a flag that once felt untouchable. Great powers don't fall, they evolve. They lied to you, not in the cartoon villain way, in the normal way, in the brochure way. In the same way a gym advertises results and hides the word depends in 8-point font. Because the truth is boring and boring truths don't get votes, don't sell bonds, don't win elections, and don't keep people calm. Here is the glitch. Empires rarely die because they get punched. They die because they get tired, financially, politically, socially, while still looking strong on the outside. The uniforms still shine, the aircraft still fly, the speeches still hit their marks, but underneath, the math starts to argue with the myth. And when math and myth collide, myth loses. Every time. Now, before the comment section starts a civil war, let me be clear. I'm not an insider, I'm not a prophet, and I'm not here to call the top. I'm here to map incentives, because incentives are the hidden hand that moves history. So let me give you the courtroom rule. We don't convict on vibes. We convict on mechanics. And the mechanical question is simple. What happens when a country's promises outgrow its capacity to pay for them, without breaking the society that made those promises in the first place? Imagine a bridge you drive across every day. It holds your car. It held your parents' car. It held the trucks that built the city. So you assume it will hold forever. But engineers don't work on assumptions. They look for fatigue. Tiny fractures in joints, rust in hidden beams, bolts that loosen a millimeter at a time. No single bolt causes the collapse. The collapse is what happens when enough small weaknesses meet a heavy enough load on the wrong day. Empires are bridges made of politics and money, so take a breath. We're not here to panic. We're here to understand the machinery because machinery can be repaired. That's how decline begins, not with a parade of tanks, with a spreadsheet that won't balance. Let's establish one uncomfortable fact. Global leadership is not a trophy, it's a subscription. The world doesn't hand you top power and walk away. It charges you monthly, in defense guarantees, in naval patrols, in diplomacy, in crisis management, in being the lender of last resort, in being the consumer of last resort, in being the market where frightened capital hides when the planet starts shaking. When your currency becomes the preferred parking lot for other nations' reserves, you gain a rare privilege. You can finance yourself more easily than others can. And here's the myth bust that belongs on a billboard. Reserve currency privilege is not free money, it's a trade. You provide the world a deep market for safe assets and, often, an open market for goods and capital. In return, the world gives you financing flexibility. But the trade has side effects. It can lift your currency, pressure your exporters, and make it easy to drift into an economy that excels at finance and consumption while underinvesting in production. Privilege is real. So is the bill attached to it. But here's the turn. Privilege rewires your domestic economy. Because if you can borrow easily, the temptation is to solve political pain with credit. If you can import cheaply, the temptation is to let production drift elsewhere. If your assets become the world's safe harbor, the temptation is to mistake rising asset prices for rising national strength. This is not a moral failure. It's a design trap. Think of it like a fire department that also sells fire insurance. At first it's great. The money rolls in, the trucks are shiny, the uniforms are crisp. But over time, the insurance revenue becomes the business model. And the business model changes the mission. Now add a second layer. Global trust has a strange side effect. It makes domestic discipline feel optional. If the world keeps lending to you, you start treating borrowing like an entitlement. If the world keeps buying your assets, you start treating valuations like validation. If the world keeps invoicing and settling in your currency, you start treating that network as a law of nature instead of a preference that can be updated. Here's what makes that turning point so hard to see. The costs arrive as maintenance, while the benefits arrive as miracles. The benefit is immediate, lower friction, lower financing stress, a sense that the system can absorb anything. The cost is delayed. Less urgency to build factories, train apprentices, modernize infrastructure, or reform budgets. You can postpone pain for a long time. And postponing pain feels like winning, until the bill shows up all at once. In finance, there's a phrase for this. You can be solvent right up until you aren't. Nations are the same, except the switch flips through politics. Here's the turning point in one sentence. Leadership stops being a profit center and becomes a balance sheet, an obligation you keep paying because the alternative feels unthinkable. And once you're inside that subscription, three illusions appear. Illusion number one, the scoreboard illusion. As long as your GDP number is big and your military is visible, you assume you're winning. But GDP can be inflated by credit, by asset booms, by consumption funded from elsewhere. A big scoreboard doesn't always mean a strong engine. Illusion number two, the map illusion. Your alliances and bases look like a crown, but every point on the map is a recurring bill. A map can be a trophy or a to-do list you can't afford. Illusion number three, the bond illusion. If people buy your debt, you assume your system is healthy. Sometimes they're buying because you're the least bad option. Sometimes they're buying because your market is deep. Sometimes they're buying because they have no alternative. Yet, those illusions are why decline often feels impossible until it's already familiar. Instead of doing the usual museum tour of famous collapses, let's examine the cycle itself, how it shows up in different costumes. I call it the 5P cycle: production, protection, prestige, promises, and payment. Production. You get rich because you make or do something the world wants. Protection. You build force to keep trade routes open, enforce rules, defend allies, secure inputs. Prestige. People treat your system as the default, so capital flows toward you. Promises. Leaders turn that prestige into commitments, some noble, some necessary, some just political. Payment. Reality checks the bill. The cycle becomes dangerous when promises grow faster than production. When payment arrives, it usually comes through three doors. Door one, crowding out. Debt service, defense, and mandatory programs compete for the same dollars. The budget becomes less a tool for building the future and more a machine for servicing the past. Door two, substitution. Instead of producing at home, you substitute imports, finance, and asset inflation. It feels like prosperity because the shelves are full. But shelves being full is not the same as a nation being capable. Door three, cynicism. When people sense the system is running on rollover and denial, they stop investing in it emotionally. They don't rebel immediately. They disengage. They stop trusting institutions, stop participating, stop believing effort is rewarded. A society can lose cohesion long before it loses territory. A historical example most people forget is a small, sea-trading republic that once financed Europe. It built advanced capital markets, became a creditor to other states, and reached a level of influence far beyond its size. But sustaining status in a contested world meant expensive wars. And expensive wars leave fingerprints, debt service. Over time, the economy tilted toward a rentier model, money made from money, while industrial dynamism softened. It didn't collapse like a movie. It aged. And aging can look like stability right up until it doesn't. Now a different costume. Late 18th century France shows how a fiscal crisis becomes a legitimacy crisis. When lenders doubt the state's ability to service obligations, politics doesn't politely adjust. It locks up. Emergency assemblies get summoned. Reform proposals become riots on paper. Notice what matters. Not only the debt but trust. Trust that the rules will be stable. Trust that taxes will be fair enough. Trust that reforms are possible without burning the house down. When that trust breaks, you get the most dangerous sentence in public finance. Why should we pay for this system? And if you want another costume, an example where debt turns into external control, look at the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. It wasn't conquered into submission in the way movies imagine. It got squeezed by financing costs, war expenses, and declining fiscal capacity. After default, creditors demanded supervision and fiscal sovereignty narrowed. That's what debt can do. It doesn't always kill you. Sometimes it puts you on a leash. Now let's make the cycle concrete with a mini case study, small enough to feel human, big enough to be instructive. New York City, mid-1970s. A city that felt permanent hit a wall, too many commitments, not enough cash, and creditors who suddenly asked a terrifying question: are you good for it? The city didn't vanish. It didn't get invaded, but it had to do something empires hate: admit limits, renegotiate, cut, reform, and rebuild credibility. Here's the key detail most people forget. Reforms weren't just cuts. They were a negotiation about who the city was for and how risk would be shared. Because that's what fiscal crisis always becomes: a fight over identity. This matters because it reveals a truth. Decline is rarely one big disaster. It's a series of temporary measures that become permanent habits. And then one day, a normal shock, rates rise, growth slows, conflict erupts, a pandemic hits, turns the habits into a crisis. That's the cycle. When credibility breaks, you either restructure voluntarily or reality restructures you. Now back to the present, not for prophecy, for diagnosis. Let's talk about the current trap, the set of incentives that make hard choices politically toxic. Trap layer 1, debt that grows faster than patience. The United States publishes its debt constantly. It's not hidden. The issue is what debt does once it becomes big enough that interest costs compete with everything else. Defense, healthcare, pensions, infrastructure, research, basic operations. When a government spends more just to service past promises, every new promise becomes more expensive. That is how the future gets mortgaged, not by evil but by arithmetic. Trap layer 2. Global responsibilities with local politics. A global posture is expensive. Even if you believe it's necessary, it still pulls resources away from domestic investment. And domestically, every program has a constituency that fights like it's oxygen, because for millions of people it is. So the system develops a reflex, borrow to avoid saying no. But borrowing is not neutral. It's a vote. A vote for continuity. A vote against reform. A vote that says, let the next decade handle it. Trap layer 3, the comfort economy. When a society becomes used to cheap goods, abundant credit, and asset appreciation, normal becomes a lifestyle. And lifestyles become political rights. Try telling a population addicted to convenience that the bill is coming due and watch what happens to your career. Here's the cruel part. Comfort is sticky. Once people build their lives around a baseline, housing costs, healthcare costs, education costs, childcare costs, reducing that baseline feels like theft, even if the baseline was built on temporary conditions. Trap layer 4. Supply dependence. Complex supply chains are efficient until they're fragile. Fragility has a hidden cost. You can't respond quickly when conditions change. You can't surge production. You can't replace parts. You can't rebuild skills overnight. It's like selling your spare tire to fund a nicer stereo. Most days you feel smarter. Then one day you're stranded. Trap layer 5. The trust fracture. When trust in institutions falls, every reform becomes suspicious. Every compromise looks like betrayal. And the system becomes unable to do the one thing successful societies must do, adapt. And there's a sixth trap layer hiding under all 5. Trap layer 6, the political risk premium. When a country's politics becomes a permanent crisis, investors start pricing the chaos. Not because they hate the country, but because uncertainty has a cost. It shows up as higher borrowing costs, higher insurance costs, more defensive corporate behavior, and less long-term investment. Ironically, that defensive posture makes growth weaker, which makes the politics harsher, which makes the pricing worse. That's why reform windows matter. In calm times, reform is optional. In stress times, reform is survival. But stress times are exactly when reform becomes hardest. Now 2 thought experiments, because sometimes you understand a system faster when you shrink it. Thought experiment number 1, the store credit empire. Imagine your neighborhood adopts Architect Bucks as the default store credit because your wallet app is smooth and everyone trusts it. At first, you can issue these credits and trade them for real goods because people want to hold them. So you start using that privilege to avoid hard choices, fund more projects, promise more services, delay repairs. Then a few shops begin accepting other credits too, quietly as a backup. Nothing explodes. But when demand for your credit softens, the extras you issued don't evaporate. They come home. Prices rise. People get angry. And the story shifts from "we're trusted" to "why did we treat trust like an infinite resource?" Thought experiment number 2. The World Security Subscription. Imagine you run a security service for your block. Everyone relies on you. Over time, more neighbors ask for protection, and you say yes, because saying no feels like losing status. To pay for it, you raise fees a little, borrow a little, and tell yourself, we can handle it. But the subscription expands faster than your income. So you borrow more, postpone maintenance, and hire fewer trainees. Your service still looks powerful, until 2 emergencies happen at once, and everyone sees you were stretched thin the whole time. Those are cartoons, but the mechanics are real. Privilege creates commitments. Commitments create strain. Strain tempts shortcuts. Shortcuts consume credibility. And credibility is the one asset you cannot print. Here's the part most people miss. A reserve currency system doesn't usually die when a rival currency wins. It dies when confidence becomes conditional. Conditional confidence looks like this. Allies still hold you, but they hold less, and they call it prudence. Trade still clears through you, but more contracts include alternatives. Investors still buy your debt, but they ask for more compensation. Your currency is still dominant, but it's no longer unquestioned. That shift is slow at first. Then, if it meets a shock, it becomes fast. Because confidence isn't a brick, it's a mood. And moods flip in crowds. That's when the feedback loops get loud. Higher financing costs force tougher budgets. Tougher budgets inflame politics. Inflamed politics makes investors demand more compensation. And the loop tightens. You don't have to predict a date to understand the mechanism. You just have to notice the system is losing slack. If you want to picture what losing slack feels like on the ground, it usually looks like a change in terms, not a blackout. Credit is still available, but it's more expensive and more selective. Imports still arrive, but more of the price swings show up at the register. The government still functions, but more of the budget is pre-committed before lawmakers even start debating. Foreign policy still projects confidence, but allies quietly ask, how long can you keep paying for this? None of that is apocalypse, it's friction. And friction is how complex systems slow down before they break. So what do you do with this? Not panic, not prophecy, not cosplay as a doomsday trader. You build resilience the same way societies do, by reducing fragility. Here's a practical playbook, principles, not orders. Respect leverage. Debt is not evil, it's a tool. But leverage is a vulnerability multiplier. If you don't control your payment schedule, someone else controls your stress. Build optionality. Optionality is the ability to say no without collapsing. That can be an emergency fund, a diversified skill set, a side income, or simply fewer fixed expenses. Keep your timeline sacred. Most people blow themselves up by taking short-term risk with long-term money. Match the volatility you can emotionally tolerate to the horizon you actually have. Diversify your dependence, not just your portfolio. People fixate on assets, gold, real estate, stocks, crypto, like there's a single lifeboat. In reality, resilience is a blend. Liquidity for shocks, productive assets for the long run, and a plan that matches your time horizon and risk tolerance. Every asset class has trade-offs: volatility, custody risk, inflation risk, concentration risk, policy risk, and plain old human error. Learn the difference between hedging and gambling. A hedge is boring by design. A gamble is exciting by design. If it feels like adrenaline, it's probably not a hedge. Build redundancy where you can. One income stream is efficient. Two income streams are resilient. One supplier is efficient. Two suppliers are resilient. One skill is efficient. A portfolio of skills is resilient. Invest in productive capacity at the personal level. Skills that travel, credentials that convert, networks that open doors. You can't control national policy, but you can control your capacity to earn, learn, and adapt. Don't confuse outrage with preparation. Outrage feels like action. It isn't. Preparation is boring. Budgeting, learning, staying healthy, and making choices that reduce fragility. Here's a simple 4-question framework you can use without becoming a headline addict. What can actually break me? Job loss, medical shock, debt reset, currency volatility, housing instability. What do I control today? Expenses, skills, savings rate, insurance, flexibility. Where is my redundancy? Backup income, emergency cash, alternative plans, supportive relationships. What is my if-then plan? If rates rise, if income falls, if costs jump, if I need to relocate. If you can answer those 4 questions on paper, you're already ahead of most people, because you've turned anxiety into a plan. One more thing, because I refuse to end this episode as a doom sermon. Systems can bend. Countries have pulled back from fiscal cliffs before. There are modern examples of governments that faced ugly debt dynamics, took political pain, restructured programs, and restored credibility over time. It wasn't magic. It was boring, budgets, reforms, and a public willing to accept trade-offs. So don't let anyone sell you inevitability. The lesson of history isn't collapse is guaranteed. The lesson is, when incentives stay the same, outcomes repeat. Change incentives and you change the story. And here's the civic point that ties this whole episode together. A country is not doomed because it has problems. A country declines when it becomes unable to solve problems. So I'm not here to declare the United States finished. History doesn't repeat like a metronome. It rhymes like a songwriter. Similar themes, new verses. The point is not certainty. The point is awareness. Because when a society believes it is exempt from constraints, it stops solving problems and starts managing optics. And optics are the first thing that breaks when reality knocks. So here's the line I want you to remember when this topic turns into a shouting match online. This is educational commentary, not financial advice. The verdict is not written, but the evidence is available. And the habits that prevent decline, productive investment, credible institutions, fiscal realism, and social cohesion, are not mysteries, they're choices. Court is adjourned.